All right. No, this is not an anamorphotic blot which your cognitive faculties are trying to resolve. We are actually in the same physical zone of signifying space. That's right. Big Sig, Nick, free beer tomorrow. We're here. We're back after a long hiatus. We had to get re-Oedipalized real quick. You know, sometimes you got to re-up the Oedipus every so often. It's not a clean or happy process,
No,
but
yeah, I had to renew my subscription, so Oedipus is now an app, so
yeah, it used to be you got Oedipalized once. Now it's like every 10 years. You got to go back to the ternary,
it's like doing your taxes.
work it out, interpolate that little a or get interpolated by it. All right, now, jokes aside, we are back and we do intend to finish seminar 3 in short order. And today we're going to be talking about the highway and the signifier, and then we might graze thou art, which is kind of like you were saying, a recap of many things that have already been said.
And the other one, which I think you did a solo to it, or was that Max on the "Thou art who will follow me," which is
Yes. Yeah. And I'm not sure thou art adds much to thou art the one who will follow me, but there's still some gems in there. The highway and the signifier, on the other hand, I would say is crucial,
yeah.
if only for this metaphor of the highway, which he's going to put to good use in this lecture. I wrote a few notes on it. We also read on a question prior to any possible treatment of psychosis, which has the R schema in it, which
Yeah,
is actually not in the
it's
seminar.
not in the seminar now,
I don't know if
and
that's something Miller cut out or what, but it would be useful to talk about that at some point, maybe not today.
and before, because I know you wrote a bunch on notes for this chapter, I'll just give a brief, since we're close to the end. Like, the purpose of the seminar really for Lacan is like an intervention, with a lot of what's going on in the IPA, and you can see like how with psychosis, the different ways in which it's diagnosed in a psychiatric sense, which we could take as like the Lacan's version back in the day of what we would now call the DSM in America, this was specifically the
Mhm.
DSM-5, which are more statistical diagnostical categories, which molecularize certain symptoms and categorize them into one specific umbrella or
Nose
table.
and then nosology.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
nosology or etiology of the symptom. And there's a lot of anti-psychiatry going on around that time too, I would imagine, with like Artie Lang, or this is like prior to 68, and like the Deleuze and Guattari, like romanticizing schizophrenia. But the point is like this is still you know a part of Lacan's return to Freud and understanding what is psychosis in the psychoanalytic sense, and what it meant for Freud. And even the fact for Freud that even though Freud, understood, through the readings of Schreber, the different dimensions of the, let's say, evolution of his delusions, his symptom formations that were structured libidinally around narcissism, which Lacan will touch on. But the fact that there is a failure in Freud in which his investigation kind of was at a standstill, and how psychoanalysis for him uh, is not eligible for the treatment of psychosis, because they don't adhere to the transference like neurosis does. And even one of the cool things about Lacan is that Lacan is brave enough to actually make um, psychoanalysis spearhead a sort of epistemological stance. Because if you notice in the writings of Freud, Freud is under the conviction of science prior to psychoanalysis. Maybe a science could further answer these questions that psychoanalysis is still under investigation,
Right.
right? Which is something that Milner talks about in his Search of Clarity, is that one of the few things that Freud was stuck in were the sort of scientisms of his day, because He
Mm,
was still under the preoccupation of searching for the ideal science while following the ideals of science. I think for Lacan, he is taking it courageously to actually not say that psychoanalysis is a science, but have a sort of epistemological um, stance within the milieu of psychoanalysis, philosophy, and even psychiatry
right.
as a specific thing.
It's like what kind of criteria would have to obtain for
Yeah,
psychoanalysis analysis to be a kind of a science, and would it be the science of other sciences?
yeah,
That's the queen of sciences, which is a major aspiration there.
yeah.
But
And the last thing I'll just conclude because it's the main thing that is going to apply to what Nick is going to be talking about for today in his present or his the notes of presentation that he's going to elaborate on is that Lacan again is not trying to create like a sort of end all be all category for psychosis or a definition that will satisfy those eager analysts waiting to be like, oh, I knew it all along. My patient's a psychotic or my patient's a hysteric. No, it is if he's aligning himself with something like a science, it's going to be with the help of structural linguistics and his rendition of the signifier that we've
right,
been talking about throughout this entire um, seminar, and that the signifier is what represents the subject for another signifier and gets its meaning from other signifiers. That the signifier is what we're looking for to understand the situation or the situatedness uh, that the subject is embedded in within a language. And psychosis
right.
is not any different from that.
So I think Lacan is spinning a few different plates here in this seminar. On the one hand, although he doesn't fully agree with Freud's conclusions, is Freud's diagnostic conclusions when it comes to Schreber, he's still advocating for a return to a Freudian methodology. So that's one thing. He states that outright in the decree we just read. He's also introducing us to the notion of the signifier proper, his gloss on it, on the South Syrian signifier, but he's doing it in a very interestingly counterintuitive way because he's almost adopting the same kind of left field approach that you get with Freud in his three essays on sexuality, where it's like Freud introduces us to his take on human sexuality through a counterintuitive avenue by first discussing what then was widely believed to be a deviation from a norm by
Right.
talking about homosexuality, by treating homosexuality prior to
Yeah. Yeah.
heterosexuality
You're
as a
right.
phenomenon. And it's like, I think Lacan is doing something similar here. He is introducing the notion of the signifier, explaining how it operates, and really bringing it to light in the most vivid colors by demonstrating what the signifier is for Schreber,
Mhm.
who is supposedly himself deviating from a norm. And I think that's really beautifully done. I don't know.
I really like the way that you made the analogy between the three essays and even what Lacan's doing with psychosis and Schreber, because like just like there is this sort of predisposition that heterosexuality is like the natural predisposition of man, and what is it the invert or the homosexual is a sort of like pathological other or inverse of that. And so like it's as if like even though the sexuology or the psychology interested in sexuality doesn't have a sort of clear and defined theory of sexuality, they could say what they want and know about homosexuality as something that needs to be fixed or rehabilitated, when Freud points out, actually, no, like they're more normal than what we would adhere to as normal. And in the same manner, looking at Lacan, criticizing those that are trying to rehabilitate delusion as if they live and a predisposition of what is considered a reality. When
Exactly.
he even says in
Exactly.
seminar or in lecture 10 about the discourse of freedom, it's like there is a collective shared delusion that we are all participating in.
Right.
And to some degree, we all oscillate between like participating and keeping it at abeyance because we then also run into the limit of our own sort of subjectivity,
Yeah.
of our own mode of attunement or relationship to symbolic articulation, whatever term you want to use. But the fact is, like, when you encounter that, you have reached a limit, and that causes a sort of breakdown in
Right.
um, one's living mode of operation. Which it's not that okay, you were healthy and now you've broken down. It's like no, you were already in a sort of unstable symbolic orientation, which has limits, which has gaps. Um, and your reaction to that is like an attempt to sustain that. The suffering patient, whether it's through neurotic fantasy or if it's through psychotic delusion, right? Psychotic hallucinations or neologisms like nerve language, soul contact, Schreber's God as a ways to rehabilitate themselves from a fractured world.
Right. So, on the one hand, through this case study and his extended commentary on it, he is helping to vivify the mechanism of the signifier. Two, he's bringing to light certain philosophical questions which are at the very heart of the emergence of the subject in a specific historical moment, reared in a specific milieu. And then, thirdly, I would say he's applying certain correctives to Freud, who Freud's treatment of this case study, the conclusions that he's drawn, in such a way that he's going to sort of clear the highway, so to speak, for further investigations of the signifier, but also he's always keeping his focus, Lacan that is, on this question of psychoanalysis and science and
Mhm.
where it stands in the bigger picture. And these were questions that Freud simply didn't have, let's say, the equipment to fully articulate. He wasn't able to raise these questions in the same vein
Yeah.
as Lacan is here. But
Yeah,
I'll
but
read some of my notes
like
here
last thing I do
for,
want to
yeah.
say is like it's also interesting with the sort of ingenuity of Lacan because he points out reading Schreber's memoirs that you could tell that Schreber is a man and a product of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And when we think of enlightenment, we also think of enlightenment philosophy and the inauguration of modernity. And when we think of that, we also have to think of modern philosophy and modern science. Now, who brought in modern philosophy, but Descartes with the Cogito? And if you look at like his method and his discourse, it's predicated around a sort of autobiography or memoir which he has to sort of take an ethics of skepticism to doubt everything he knows. He's traveled the world and he sees like what the people of France and living in European society we call brutes actually have the same disposition as the sort of educated European man. So I have to doubt that these people are naturally in a disposition of being brutes and savages and have no understanding of morality or knowledge of the stars, etc.
Mhm.
And I have to doubt my education. So he's
Mhm.
already starting from having to let
Mhm.
go of what he's learned through Jesuit school, etc. And what Mikey told us in that conversation that we had, that if there's the subjectivity that Lacan's interested in, it's in the second discourse or second meditation, where like the subject is not that, it's not this, it's not that. But tie that in with Schreber's investigation in the memoirs because he starts off with saying that he's proved God's existence.
Mhm.
Now, Descartes ultimately has to bring in God from the possibility of having a world of deception, a world of falsity where he's being deceived by an evil demon.
Mhm.
But proving that he's thinking because he doubts, and because he's doubting, he's thinking, and he's thinking that he exists. then God brings forth the field of knowledge and certainty for him, right? And even a
Yeah.
world of possibility of doubting. But God is the guarantor of it all. But he has to build up to that, even if it's fallacious for him to posit that God is the guarantor of certainty and knowledge. Schreber, as a man of the Enlightenment, starts off with that he's proved God, and through the methods of enlightenment, that allows him to further on his investigation of his own paranoid delusions as miracles and as visions that would be beneficial to not only science but theology as well.
Right. And so some of the questions being raised here, some of the themes which are put into question through Schreber's account of his own delusions, an account which is very precise and poetically articulated and in its own right, almost scientific, we could say, because it follows a certain logic which we could map with great clarity, so long as we really put the microscope, I was gonna
Yeah.
say microphone, microscope on the details therein. But some of the questions being raised here are modern civilization's relationship to a notion of a non-deceiving God, and how we reconstitute a primordial real, and what that bears on the question of the name of the Father, the pronomial name of the Father as the shifter, as the I, how this I, which refers to myself, which I need to have some sort of grasp upon, which I need to be able to pilot almost, actually reflects an entire cluster of cultural connotations,
Right.
and very shaky, increasingly so in these uncertain times, connections with the world around us, many ideologically loaded ideas, prejudices, which once investigated don't really line up with one another. They can't be held to the light of day without falling apart. And really, it's like there's a clarity of focus in what Schreber is doing, which reveals the inherent instability of not just his world, but this shared delusion, which we have, all of us, a very ambivalent relationship to. And ever more so in this era of conspiracy theories, endless information, data transfer and processing, both in a technological sense, but also in the sense that we need to situate ourselves in this endless stream of information, which we can't really assimilate any kind of conviction
Mhm,
of there being a non-deceptive real
mhm.
to that endless proliferation of information. But now I'm just kind of rambling here. I wanted to read something that I wrote just to get us started, see if you agree with it, see if you find some faults in it, see if there's any launching points for further thinking. So, all of these statements that are unfinished, which have to do with the code and the message, Lacan says that Schreber experiences in these interrupted statements a code which is kind of detached from the message. The message is never quite conveyed, but the idea of a message, the container of the message, is what's referred to here and pointed to with a certain urgency by the statement itself. It never lands, it never arrives anywhere, it doesn't quilt. So there are all these gradations of meaning interpolated amongst the various endings to the statements that begin with the pronoun thou, thou art. And Lacan enumerates in a few of these chapters various possible endings. There are certain subtleties to the different tenses and conjugations and whatnot that escape me because I don't speak French and they can't be rendered in English exactly. But there are these nuances that imply something temporal. There's a change in the temporality of the statement, whether you're talking about perfect tense, past perfect, whatever. And there's also a temporality to the metaphor that's ignited in the passage that needs to be achieved when we go from thou art to the one. Lacan calls this the one, the screen that
Mhm.
we need to pass through for some of these connotations to be activated in wilt follow, will follow, whether it's a commandment, whether it's a mandate. These are subtle connotations that we can't even really investigate, but we follow unconsciously if we're neurotic subjects. There are subtexts here, which in the neurotic subject attest to like an installation of the name of the father at the heart of a castrated subject, one who has, to the extent that you can, accepted your castration. And the lack of signifying connotation, which exists in distinction from this persecutory, this interpolative, this challenging tone that Schreber always experiences when these sentences are cut off. It's as if he's experiencing these sentences as Lacan calls it an interrogation, series of commandments, and it's a series of commandments which reenacts the mirror stage rivalry of the
Mhm.
imaginary. There's always a dyadic relationship that is the motor of these statements, which can never be resolved, can never reach a quilting point. And I think there's a certain character of the slave and bondsman relationship in these statements that comes through. The thou of the statement doesn't allow for this passage to the screen, which would be the formation of this third person. And sometimes the you in a statement like you need to turn right once you reach the corner of the
Mhm.
street is a third person you that as a neurotic subject you can assume the mantle of that by finding a place within the other.
Yeah.
And just to sum up what I wrote here, basically, I think of this as there's a kind of I almost want to call it a time lapse. I don't know if that's the most appropriate term here, but like a time lapse that occurs when you get from the beginning of thou art the one in the middle and then who will follow me. There's a kind of temporal shift or change or transubstantiation, almost to use a very
Mhm.
fancy term, that happens there, which is not available to a a Schreber.
Yeah, because like thinking about that, it makes me think of like the example that Leon Brenner gave us in our conversation with him towards the beginning of working through Seminar 3 when he talks about the retroactivity of the statement, which
Mhm.
makes it's able to give the subject of the statement the meaning, and that logical or temporal time of the statement or the mandate or the command. And for this instance, look out, look out for, look out for your look out for your team, look out for your teammate, in the way that there is that transformation and signification that comes about towards the end. And retroactively, you think about the meaning of uh, what was imposed onto the subject of the statement via the predicate. And in the same way, we could see this with thou art the one who will follow me, right? If there's only a thou art, right, and the rest of the message is cut off, well, it's never fully received, right? Message is supposed to be delivered and received, but he's not getting it. He's only getting the thou, which seems to almost have this sort of not just interruption, but this appearance of being too much of an interrogation and sort of aggressive rivalry, because he has to fill in those statements, right? Because they're not only being cut off, but there's also like this sort of interruption of these different like hallucinatory sounds that mask over the other's message to him, correct?
Mhm.
Yeah. And so like for the instance of like this statement, thou art the one, right? Thou is addressed as you, but it's not enough to say thou. What does thou refer to? Then when you say thou art the one, now we have put more meaning into the emphasis of the subject note of the statement known as thou. The thou art the one who will follow me. And so now there's not only the evocation of an other of the statement, but then also of the me that's also addressed in there. So you have this sort of triadic relation between thou, the one, and then me, right? In that thing. So I don't know if I'm getting at what you're saying or what you summarized, but it almost seems like those sort of three focal points of the statement matter for the message to have any effect or signification. At the level of the neurotic, it would make more
Right.
sense, but because it's cut off and we're only left with thou art, right? Or the thou, it's only a thou and the me, or thou and the I, maybe for Schreber. He has to posit himself as somewhere within this cut off statement or
Yeah.
message of thou. So it's
Yeah.
like he has to crack the code, but he doesn't have,
Right.
the complete thing. It's blotched out.
And it strikes him as something aggressive. It's erotic. It's taunting.
Mhm.
And it's what you might experience if you are a victim, let's say, of the Althusserian hail
Yeah.
of "Hey, you."
Yeah.
You. You know, if you're driving and someone honks their horn and you don't always know immediately if you are the recipient of
Yeah.
that horn honk or not, but there's a sense of alarm where it's like, who am I in this moment? Am I the perpetrator? Did I do something wrong?
Mhm.
And of course, c- contemporaneous with that question is the question of, well, who would dare
Yeah. That's a good point.
challenge me in a sense? And it's sort of like the other here needs to have the character of someone who speaks directly to Schreber and
Mhm.
doesn't invoke a legislative contractual other that is our
Mhm.
shared delusion of a society in which everyone is simultaneously
Mhm.
invoked, and then we find our place in the crowd.
Mhm. I also think that example though of like the hey you, or like being honked at, it seems to also then ask like the difference between like how someone like Schraber or someone who's like an ordinary neurotic or whatever will respond, because of the example of the hey you for Althusser. When I look back, I see that there is a cop in uniform. So like there's already sort of imaginary symbolic associations that are backed up by just the statement of the hey you there. And even though he's not pointing to me, it's somebody behind me. um I can only retroactively understand that afterwards, but there was still some type of associations that, oh shit, am I breaking the law? Because in that moment I'm subject to the ideology of the law in the form of the police officer saying hey you. Whereas like in the difference of the
Mm,
honk, right, the honk makes me feel like, oh shit, did I cut somebody off? But I'm always given the possibility of, have I done this or did I do that? Where it seems like even that doesn't have a lot of wiggle room for Schraber because of just the interruption. There's only this thou, right, or thou art, and like the rest of it's cut up, so you can't even navigate cognitively, can't even cognitively map something from that. And I think the real
yeah.
erotic and aggressivity that you're pointing out comes from the fact that he has to like establish some type of like frame around that libidinally. or like in whatever term you want to use, like with his sort of orientation of trying to make up something like symbolic meaning because of the inoperative ability of the signifier. He has to like fill in the gaps with some type of imaginary representation.
Well, without sounding too Deleuzian here, it's almost like he has to reterritorialize his entire body
Right,
to
right.
respond to these directives
Mhm.
because he experiences them as ultimately ambiguous, opaque directives or instructions, which are certainly for him, but which ultimately involve periodic reconfigurations of his universe, which is just a universe that ultimately he has to give birth to. He has to be the one that gives birth to a humanity which will enter
Mhm.
a new purified age in a
Yeah.
sense. And I don't know that my example is perfectly apt there with the honk or the Althusserian hail, but there is a sense in which there's an interrogation. It's just that, yeah, authority for him isn't what it would mean to the person in the Althusserian example, who is
Right.
already, like you said, embedded in this symbolic imaginary life world.
Yeah, I do want to get into more of how the signifier and even this metaphor of the highway play into it, but even just like in the thou art chapter, the distinction that he makes between a commandment versus the mandate. So
Yes.
thou will follow me uh is a commandment versus thou art the one who will follow me is a mandate, right? Which spreads out more in a sort of s- let's say less granular and more like specific and even multiplicity, a particular way, whereas the commandment is supposed to universalize everybody as a subject. uh Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, thou shalt not murder, right? Rather, thou will be the one to not murder, right? It's kind of different. There's a difference between like something that encompasses everybody universally versus sort of this sort of particular existence of a one.
Well, apropos of that, the I is the thou. I mean, if you have assimilated the I, then you are theoretically able to respond to that hail correctly. Now, there really is no correct way. There really is no unambiguous way of responding to the interpolation ultimately, but there is that metaphoric effect of temporarily finding one's place within the other, which
Mhm.
is encompassing, and this is only through castration of giving up some portion of your being, which, and of course this is not a willful choice on the part of Schreber, but let's say he is unwilling to
Mhm. Mhm.
sacrifice for the sake of, well, how do we understand society, everyone is doing their part, and I have a specific job and you have a specific job, and ideally we're doing our part to uphold something. We're not sure what exactly, but we are sewn into the fabric
Mhm.
of another, which is not you specifically or me specifically. And even if we have questions about that as Marxists or anarchists or whatever, when we're going about our day, as long as we're decent people and obeying the rules of
Mhm.
civic society, that's the assumption. And we hope that contractually speaking, the people that we encounter in traffic or in customer service or at our jobs or whatever have agreed to
Mhm.
that contract. That does not need to be made explicit until it does. Um, that's kind of getting us a field of what I want to talk about, but at the same time, I think it has something to do with this Cartesian dilemma of how do I apply skepticism as a methodology to everything that I know, and then reach a non-deceptive kernel.
Mhm.
Now, this is an epistemological question, but it also has something to do with the law. And the law as it's recognized by a community,
Mhm. Yeah,
ideally.
absolutely, absolutely.
And believe it or not, what does that have to do with linguistics? Well, here's Lacan's ecumenical eclecticism in that, well, that I is
Mhm.
the essentialization, is the concentration of all of those questions,
Yeah.
which once assumed only via repression allows us to kind of navigate through this world. Now, what Lacan is saying here, bringing up Aristotle, is that for Aristotle, it's like the wheeling motions of the heavens are equated with a primordial real.
Mhm.
God doesn't really need to speak in the first person. The
Right.
Greek God of Aristotle has no need of really
Yeah.
speaking in the first person. And that God could even accommodate the pantheon of Greek gods that do speak
Yeah,
in the first person, that
exactly.
act in the first person, because one God, the Aristotelian God, doesn't necessarily preclude the local deities
Right.
necessarily, because it's not the same thing. Whereas the
The
Christian God
God, the God of
does
Hebrews.
oust
Yeah,
the world
yeah.
of the either like condemns those gods as demons, as
Mhm.
false prophets or false deities or whatever, but there's no room
Yeah.
for a Judeo-Christian God and the
The
pantheon
Panther, yeah,
of
and it's
gods
also
necessarily.
interesting too because when you get into the God of Abraham, when Moses says at the burning bush, asks him who he is, he says, "I am what I am," or "I am that I is," whatever the Hebrew translation is. Because I know Lagan will talk about that
Yes.
as in Seminar 16, "I am what I is," but the fact that he does refer to himself in the first person and predicates himself off the first person pronoun of I am what I am, right? So that brings up another sort of dilemma, but also when it comes to Aristotle as well, not even just the God that doesn't have to refer to themselves in first person pronoun, or even address themselves or take into account, or even address others as thou. Um, Aristotle's syllogism of the infamous "all men are mortal," right? There is a statement that has a syllogistic consequence, right? And Lacan will play out like this throughout his entire career. Um, all Frenchmen ought to die for their country, right?
Mm.
But does every Frenchman, die for their country? It's not this. It's not the same. I think he says something. It's like it's not the same to say like all Frenchmen ought to die for their country versus there is not one Frenchman who does not die for their country, right? I think he like plays on this different negation, but I think it's interesting thinking about the statement of all men are mortal, and then what constitutes them of being mortal is that they also have to be man, right? Or man has to be mortal. But for Schreber, this phrase that he says had me thinking about this. I don't know if like I'm just kind of uh spitballing, but when he says enlightenment rarely given to mortals has been given to me, right? And this sort of like interesting thing where he's like, rarely given to mortals. So like, all mortal men are definitely not enlightened, right?
Yeah.
But there is at least one mortal man who has enlightenment, right? So, like, how he situates himself within the universal all versus the existential particular, but still having to avow some law about mortality and being immortal and being a man at the same time. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm trying to get at something, but it's like when we
Yeah,
think about
yeah.
Aristotle, not just about the sort of prime mover, indifferent, abstract god of the philosophers, but then also with law, what constitutes somebody under the law? All men, right? uh, and the commandments of thou shalt, right? And then with someone like Schreber traversing through this problem of the law and being a man of enlightenment who says that, enlightenment rarely given to mortals has been given to me, right?
Well, so what that just made me think of is it's like, to bring it back to the law, if the translation is "I am what I is" instead of "I am what I am,"
Mhm.
which is what the burning bush says to Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, then it's like it's drawing on the exact Russell's set problem of the name of the father being the quilting point of all quilting points, because if it's like, if I stands for the law and the God of the Hebrews is both the source of and also subject to the law, then that introduces
Right.
a paradox that's at the heart of the assumption of the personal pronoun I. What Lacan says here is that the entities that are organized into sort of like Aristotelian phyla for the
Hmm.
Greeks, and it's not just Aristotle that does this. Obviously, there's a diversity of thought among ancient Greeks, but it has less to do with the being of these entities than it does their organization. Whereas the question of I am, what I is, brings into question being, right?
Hmm.
And this question of being is going to lead Schreber to his psychotic break,
Hmm.
which happens, as we've talked about many times, when he is appointed a judicial president,
Right.
and the question of being a father
Yeah.
is presented to him. He's confronted with it in the most starkly critical manner. And it's like, what I wrote here is that the insecurity that
Hmm.
it introduces is kind of like what we're dealing with when we lose the identification of the other
Hmm.
with this a non-deceptive primordial real.
Hmm.
Now, maybe this is a stretch, but I think as long as we assume others agree to the kind of social contract that I was talking to, we at least in our minds are able to calm ourselves by believing that there is a non-deceptive
Right.
truth that we or agreement
Hmm.
that exists beyond signifying differentiality. Whereas for Schreber, he needs to actually like get his hands dirty and extract that sense of security from language itself, because it hasn't been given to him
Yeah.
through Oedipus. I
Yeah,
don't know if
and
that makes
also
sense.
like
Yeah.
I thinking of like just the problem of like how the signifier, which is sort of inactive for him, the signifier would not only just grant for the problem of his delusion like presence and absence, but we could think of it in another light, something like abstraction, right? Um, and why it got me thinking about like abstraction or like real abstraction is because like you know if you're like the sort of like what's it relativist or like the sort of like um rad like leftist academic that's like, oh, this is all eurocentric, we have to cater to like all these different like indigenous groups and identities that don't conform to like universality, right? And in a sense, like, yeah, maybe there's something to that because like the hey you of the Althusserian arbiter of the laws policeman would have no effect onto like let's say what's the tribe of Levi Strauss, the Trobianders or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, or like to use Karatani terms, people in the mode A of exchange of the gift giving, right? But that's not to say that they don't have any form of universalization. It's like the gift exchange has like a sort of primitive form of abstraction through the fact that I'm waiting for not just like the thing to give, but also its return in it's like another form, right? So like within these multiple forms of abstract or like concrete exchange, like something of like abstraction comes out, and it's no, maybe I'm going out of a whim, but it's like it's no coincidence that like this has to do with law, right? These forms of law that bring forth exchange, and we see how this operates from the level of the primitives to now in the modern bourgeois society where exchange has this sort of universal quality of capital, right? Which sort of is the vanishing mediator of our social existence. But to put it into psychoanalytic terms, it's like there's a problem of abstraction and the exchange of the signifier because it's an operative. He has to create something like that because the signifier of not only presence and absence, but also of differential exchange would allow him to displace, condense all these things into one thing. I mean, that's why I like Zizek when he talks about like the homology between capital, the signifier, and the reflection of the one. And for they know not what they do, it's like
Mhm.
Attali's whole fear of God is the sort of universal equivalent, which would quilt all fears into
Right.
one thing and act as a sort of whether it's a displacement or metaphorical substitute, which I think needs to be also clarified because if I'm not mistaken, for Jakobson and what Lacan will take off with the signifier, metaphor is not merely just like the other analogous form of like figurative language like simile, but it's rather a form of substitution on a plane of
Substitution, yeah. Yeah, yeah,
substitution of
absolutely,
term,
yeah.
right? That's a more technical thing, right? And so like the substitute effect, which would create another chain of signification, is not at all functioning for Schreber as it would for a neurotic to be able to repress that under like a certain signifier, right? Which would embed all these symptomal things. Um, yeah, I kind of got lost saying,
No,
but
no,
like I
no.
know this whole thing about like which brings into context, like because I think what I'm trying to say is to bring into context what the problem of Schreber is, but is also indicative of modern society, is that he's dealing with something like being a father, right? And
Right.
that brings on a term of universalization. He's not just a father, but father itself has a sort of universal function to it, right?
Right. So, I guess in an attempt to simplify what we're talking about here, because there are a lot of byways, in our conversation right now that could lead to the highway of the signifier, it's like this I, which stands for the speech act itself, which would be commensurate with the quilting point with punctuation. It's like the I only sort of unleashes its full potential once we hit
Mm-hmm.
that full stop.
Mm-hmm.
And it never really contains any specific sentence as being fully descriptive of any kind of essence or reality. Another sentence, another signifier comes into play to fill in the gap that's introduced. And this is as maddening for a neurotic as it is for a psychotic, but more so for a psychotic because they have to live out in real time the actual almost like pl- plastic transformation of their reality, which I mean, the delusion that they invent is a way to cope with the exact thing that our shared delusion is geared towards coping with, which is absence of sexual complementarity
Mm-hmm.
ultimately,
Yeah.
in a sense. What does that all mean? Well, okay, to assume the pronomial I to be the I of the statement. Well, this wasn't really an issue for Schreber until the question of fatherhood is presented to him, and then it's like in very simple terms, well, what does this I signify? It must signify the father, which signifies the law. What is the law? What does it mean to be a father? And how can I be a father if no specific function is accorded to fatherhood
Yeah.
in terms of in terms that would
Mm-hmm.
explain procreation, and this signifier itself procreation becomes a problem for Schreber because it's like the symbolic order itself is hemmed in, is circumscribed.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I should say circumcised, almost in a sense, by two signifiers, procreation and death.
Yeah.
Things that cannot be accounted for by the symbolic order, but doesn't necessarily stand, they don't stand as mysterious beyonds to the symbolic order so much as the cause of the whole play of signifiers
Yeah.
themselves, which cannot encompass, which can't throw a net over those two realities, which are actually instituted by the signifier
Yeah,
itself.
and it is also interesting because like at least for death, we have like symbolic articulations of it, which is why like Lacan and like his Seminar 7 will talk about like the between two deaths, you have like symbolic death and real death. But, like, for sex, it's like we have nothing that could be accounted for, like, that's the sort of real of, like, the entire, structure is that, like, sex is absent, right? And, we only have, like, a signifier that covers over that or acts as a sort of, like, organon to be able to, um, fill in the, impossibility of sex, which is the phallus. I mean, and that the phallus is pretty much what constitutes the two sexual positions of man and woman. But ultimately, like this is Oedipus. Like
Yeah.
this is the Oedipal like reconciliation that would, of course, be a different type of symptom we'd be struggling with, but it would be one where it would be the sort of thing that would help Schreber from falling into delusion, but he rejects it, right? I think it's interesting because he what triggers his symptom or to triggers like his psychotic breakdown, I should be more accurate about, is the question of being a father. And being a father would also being a man, right?
Yeah.
And in his breakdown, what does he say in at one moment? What would it be like to be a woman to succumb to orgasm or to succumb to sexual pleasure? But it's not to say that he's the opposite of man, which is woman, but he is rather trying to encompass this position of not man, right? Sort of uh, rejection or negation of man and trying to fill it in with something like woman, but it would only be for God, right? It would only be God's woman. And when he encounters God in one instance, what does he call him? Luder, right? Which like translates to bitch, which it wouldn't be, he's not,
God,
God's not,
Schreber.
yeah,
Yeah.
God's not addressing him as my woman, right? But bitch, right? Which, is
Right.
that a stand in for woman or is that something completely, different from that?
Well, there can't be any parity between him and God as this embodied, personified form of the other, what would
Mhm.
contain the other. There can't be this equality. So ultimately, he can only resort to the erotic, aggressive dyad of that imaginary mirror stage to have any relation to God, and to submit
Yeah.
to God is to be a party to his insults, almost in a
Yeah.
sense. I think it's like it's a difficult point, and
Yeah.
it's easy to miss this stickleback kind of
Yeah.
erotic response that happens at that juncture.
And he doesn't doubt that he's God's lover or God's woman, but he's just at like he's certain, but he at least isn't like he doesn't have all the knowledge of like what exactly God would want from him, other than that he wants him and only him. And like in the beginning of this conversation, I juxtaposed Descartes with Schreber as like two men of the Enlightenment. Well, then like look at another juxtaposition between him and Dora, because not only is Dora a neurotic or hysteric, and she kind of fits in this sort of quadruplicity dynamic of herself, Frauke, which is the lover of Herke, but also having an affair with her father. And this is supposed to be like her alter ego or who she's mirroring to try to develop some sort of femininity or feminine identity.
Yeah.
But merely she wants to know what is woman because that would answer the key to her father's desire or what men want because it's sort of this knowledge about womanhood that she's trying to acquire. Whereas like Schreber is not trying to acquire some knowledge about being God's lover, really. He just knows that he is God's lover.
But
Yeah.
not to cut you off, what just, like, occurred to me, though, that's so interesting is that, like, what's his question? Not what is it to be a woman?
Mhm.
The two questions that he's dealing with are, what does it mean to be a father? But also, what kind of pleasure does a
As a
woman
woman.
experience
Yeah.
in her orgasm? Do you know why the ancient Greek seer Tiresias
Mhm.
is punished by Zeus? Is because Zeus had a debate with Hera, I think, or the female gods over who had like the more pleasurable orgasm,
Right.
men or women. And Tiresias, who's like all knowing, all seeing, said it's like it's actually women who have the better orgasm, and then he's punished by being turned into a woman, strangely
Mm.
enough. But I don't know what to make of that, but there's
That's
something going
interesting.
on there that
Yeah.
just like occurred to me where it's kind of like he can slip into, with all the connotations of slip into a, illusory, delusional knowledge of what it means to be one of the two sexes
Yeah.
if he can kind of, Schreber that is, understand the riddle of the female orgasm in a
Yeah.
sense. And I think it's like he begins with just that slightly innocent question
Mhm.
of what kind of an orgasm a woman
Yeah.
experiences, and ends by repopulating
Yeah.
the planet.
Yeah, exactly,
you
right.
know, so it's a question of knowledge,
Yeah.
right? It's a question of knowledge and knowing in the biblical sense, which
Yeah.
of course refers to sex and jouissance
Yeah, yeah,
ultimately.
ultimately, yeah.
Yeah. Um, I don't know where I was taking that, but it's something that just like kind of occurred to me. It's like so interesting
Yeah,
how
because like
condenses all
yeah,
this.
because lastly, like just to reiterate the points, like he's, psychotic structures structured around foreclosure or rejection of a phone to, and he's rejecting not only any knowledge of castration, but even to submit to the logic of castration, which would sexuate him. And so even if there is something with his masculinity or the problems of being a father, repression would be able to metaphorize it, displace it, so where he could be both a father and a president, but still suffer in ways, or maybe you would be a father, but then like to sort of deny some of the repression that occurs. He'd probably have an affair, or maybe he would hang out with the boys and like have like a mistress or like fuck hookers or something like that, to sort of have a sort of distance of being infidelity to the title of a father. But in this instance, he's rejecting all knowledge of that by also inquiring the what it seems to be the opposite of not what it means to be a woman, but the pleasure of a woman, right? But it's like an attempt because he has negated fatherhood, so he's stuck between the precipice of like being a non-being, but there's no like difference or contrary that comes in, right? So like the example of the signifier that Lacan gives in chapters 10 and 11 about like the piece of the evening, right? Or the signifier has this nihilating function. So evening, its opposite wouldn't be day, it'd be not evening. So he's like in this precipice of father and not father. And so like he's trying to attempt to understand womanhood to act as this sort of neurotic contrary, because that's what
Right.
would
Yeah.
happen
Yeah.
in the
Yeah. Yeah.
signification, right, of the signifying function.
Yeah. It's like Guy Le Gouffet
Yeah, yeah.
or Gauffet. I hope I didn't
Yeah,
mess
Gila
it.
Gaffey.
Guy Le Gouffet. I was like reading his introduction to his book on the formula of sexuation, and he says the real problem of the two species in one genus is the question of how two things can be opposite to one another without there being a reference point. The reference point here is the phallus, but the phallus is only an index of its own impossibility. So it isn't a stable reference point so long as like you look it in the eye in a
Yeah.
sense. And that's what
Yeah.
he's doing. He's
Yeah.
looking the, one-eyed dragon
The one-eyed Willie.
in the eye, and it's causing him all sorts of problems. I think this issue of procreation, I don't know if my takes here are too eccentric or what, but I'm just kind of spitball. It's like this issue of procreation and the idea that the symbolic order can't account for it. Well, I've had some trouble understanding what that means because it's like, well, scientifically, it's you got the fertilization of the egg and spermatozoa, and I mean, yeah, that makes sense, but it's really like a set theoretical issue in the sense that
Right.
what is the cause of generation? It's the same question of like the prime mover,
Mhm.
essentially.
Or what came
What's
first,
the
the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, like what's the prime mover? And I think it's like it's easier for him to become a woman because it might make more sense. It might be more intuitive to be that which takes the seed
Mhm.
and incubates the seed rather than the one that imparts it.
Right.
And the problem with the kuvad or whatever, which is like the male pregnancy and these so-called like primitive societies who believe that there needs to be a certain symbolic intervention of a totemic animal or
Right.
a totemic uh, plant or something that should be present in order for copulation to actually happen is not that it's lost on these people that there's such a thing as insemination.
Mhm.
They know there's insemination, but it's one way of dealing with the impossible question of how to take the homunculus of the fully formed little person that
Mhm.
is hanging out in the sperm cell and like unleash that in the way the medievals thought. That's like one way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Whatever you think of it, however you think of it, you're bound to reach the limits of the ridiculous and the absurd and the limits of psychotic freedom because there is really no way to resolve this question of generation. That's what I make of
Yeah, no, that's a really
his
good point.
like
Yeah.
struggle with it because it didn't really make sense to me. And like you were saying, death is in a sense better registered by the symbolic order, but death it's the same question. It's like, and here we can bring in the highway. Eh, how do we have a point of departure and a point of arrival?
Mhm.
These are two things that the symbolic order can't really
Mhm.
explain is like a point of departure and point of arrival.
Mm.
Departure is procreation, arrival is death.
Mhm.
And the highway is a great image because, as he said, it's not like the Roman road, which we do imagine the Via Appia or whatever as having a beginning and an end. It's not like a highway. You could say, oh, it starts in Rome and it leads to um, Cologne or whatever.
Mhm.
But the highway, you don't think of the highway as having a strict beginning or end.
Right.
That's why he says it's the presencing of an original reality.
Yes.
There
Yeah.
are points of egress and ingress, and there are off ramps and on ramps. But when you think about a highway, you really don't think of a highway as
Mhm.
starting somewhere and
Start, yeah.
ending somewhere
Yeah.
else. That's the name of the Father.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah, because it's different from a road, right? Or like various roads that would take you to get to like the specific place. But the fact that like miscellaneous roads are sort of the offshoot of the highway. It's like it acts as like one sort of substitute for all the multiplicity of roads it would take you to even try to get to a destination of arrival, right? Regardless of where you depart from, the highway acts like as this one granular thing, which I take it that the highway is not necessarily the signifier, but it's more like the pathway for the signifier, right? And I would take that as like different parts of speech, and the speech that has the signifier in it is more synonymous to like the highway, which for the signifier doesn't have to have a specific starting point, but it sort of manifests within speech as and he's always using in these early seminars um circuits, the circuit of the telegram, the message, and now it's like the path of the highway or the road for the signifier to operate. And the signifier we're focusing on, of course, is the signifier that is the name of the Father, right? And it seems like for Schreber, that of course is an operative. That's what he rejects. And a lot of Lacanians get this wrong because they'll say, "Oh, the big other is foreclosed." No, no. it's the signifier that's foreclosed. It's rejected, right? And it remains inoperative. It's not to say that they don't have a an unconscious or a signifier. It's that it remains inoperative. It doesn't function with metaphor and metonymy proper like the neurotic. It's actually left in abeyance, right? Kept out and patched up by sort of imaginary delusions. Or if it somehow comes into a sort of almost, let's say, like proto operation, it has to be cut off, in the code, right? It never becomes a full message because the signifier would, or the letter would operate in that message, right? It's what is delivered, right? But it never arrives. So there's something that, like, the problem of the highway uh is also a problem for Schreber because he never arrived somewhere, right? Who knows where he departs, but he never arrives because there would have to be a destination. Just like there's also a destination for a letter or a message.
And
Yeah.
it's like what Lacan says here is he takes all of these different byways and minor roads.
Mhm.
And when you forego taking the highway, it's like you have to pay a lot more attention to where you're going and the signs along the way
Mhm.
because it's not just a straight
The shot,
shot.
yeah.
So they're all different signs and signifiers that he's experiencing to the point where they crowd his vision or his hearing to the level of pandemonium.
Right, and that and to bring in the registers, it would be all too imaginary to think of the highway as a straight shot. In Euclidean geometry is so imaginary because it starts from the space of at least 2 points, right? And then of course you can make a plane of 4 points, but that's still very imaginary because it's also intuitive and we could represent that in our minds. But something like a highway that isn't straight shot, we have to account for these divergences or signs of detours that we can only understand as they present themselves to us in reality, not to be Heideggerian, but they sort of reveal themselves in the analytic experience.
Yeah.
Driving to you on the highway, like it's not a straight shot to get from East Falls all the way to South Philly, because the highway I think I gotta go like I gotta stay on the left and then merge onto this one. It's of course still the same highway, but the detours are in loops or they go off in like weird like divergences. I'm always thinking of that meme of like go straight or go this way, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but like if you're on the I-95 or if you're in parts of the country where it is a straight shot, where it is just like a horizon and
Okay. Like Route
endlessly
66.
Route 66 is what I meant to say. Endlessly receding horizon, you won't think I'm on the highway. Like you'll forget that you're on a highway. It becomes unconscious. The highway is just there.
Yeah.
You still have to read signs and mind the speed limit or keep up with other cars as fast as they're going, but you forget there's even a highway there is the thing. So I guess to put it in kind of stupid terms, it's like taking for granted a name of the Father, which is not granted to
Mhm.
to Schreber. So he has to resort to taking all sorts of back roads and to actually driving through the circuit
Mhm.
itself of language and signifiers and of trying to understand what is being asked of him. And I think of this as sort of, we talked about this briefly in our conversation with Nance and Mikey, but signifier's algorithm.
Mhm.
And if you haven't incorporated, like you're saying, signifier capital S, but you have
Mhm.
signifiers always buzzing and humming
Yeah.
around you, then the necessity of trying to find some kind of legibility
Yeah.
within this pandemonium uh, is madness.
Yeah. And one of the things I think we could also bring up is like, one of the laziness that you hear in a lot of like Lacanian groups or like words that people take for granted to be like, oh yeah, like because they confuse language with the symbolic. But I think one of the more like it's both sophisticated, but it's also very like just simple when it comes to Lacan's use of language. um his theory of language is not an idealist one, and it's not metaphysical. He's not trying to create a metaphysical ontology of language, nor is he trying to create some idealism that exists within the mind. It's not a psychologism or an idea of language, but that insofar as we're social speaking beings, language exists.
Yeah.
So when the child is born, they're not oh, they're first imaginary, and then they enter into the symbolic. It's like, no, they're actually thrown into language, and language has this sort of imaginary component that allows for the narcissism or the ego to kind of inaugurate itself. But language is just like a sort of a mixture of just like whatever they hear the mother say, but it's all auditory and it's sort of discombobulated. It's not differentiated. The symbolic aspect of language would be the presence and absence. It would
Yeah.
be the signifier that would operate the algorithmic
Yeah.
logic. And so because Schreber doesn't have that algorithm of plus and minus of negation and differentiation or difference, he's got to work with like a bunch of like auditory imaginary language that's sort of like a sort of pool that isn't differentiated or metaphorized by the signifier as such. And so, like, that's why he has to create neologisms like, was it never ender or nerve contact, soul language, soul,
Nervin Hanang
yeah, soul murderer,
or
uh,
Nervin Nanhang or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah, nerve contact language. Like these are sorts of attempts to try to like create some type of meaning and differentiation within the way that he's situated into language. And I also think like in something that I've been like grappling with is like um because it's not to say that they are without metaphor, but the way that the metaphor of the signifier operates as substitution doesn't act the same way in the psychotic. But Lacan will talk about like the grammatical and syntax structure of the unconscious structure like a language. And because of that, even logic itself is not uh, opposed to language, or it could be outside of language. There's no meta language. That logic itself is a sort of structured grammatization of already existing language. So he'll say something like, what does he say? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously,
Mhm.
right?
Right, right, yeah.
That's yeah, and that right there, even though it doesn't really
Lo
make any sense at all, it still conforms to the logical structure of grammar.
what's the other one? Like, love is a laughing pearl or
Yeah, love is a
something.
laughing
I
pearl.
might have gotten that
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
yeah.
Or I made one up the one time I texted you. It was like, what was it? Something about like rocking the Madison Square Garden with Mercutio, and so far as he gets drunk off the Holy Spirit, right?
You wanna
Yeah, I'll take it. And so, like, the point is that like even though none of those made sense, that they still have to conform to a grammatical structure where there is a shifter of the subject and the predicate, or something like the signifier, and that is what is an operative for um the speech or the discourse of the psychotic, because it's so metonymic and it's so all over the place that it's a run-on sentence, or like you can never tell the difference between the subject and the predicate of these things of the speech of the psychotic. So I think that's like something that is also crucial clinically and practically, that I've been trying to think about, like the difference between speech as a highway or as a circuit from the neurotic versus the psychotic. Even if there's like something that doesn't make sense, like let's say that sort of like colorless green idea sleep furiously wasn't something that the neurotic said. They may have had a dream, like I had a dream of like my mother doing this that, and then she whispered to me and said, "Colorless green idea sleep furiously," or "Thou art the one who will follow me to heaven's end." Right? Like all these things that seem to make no sense, but yet they follow grammatical logic that doesn't seem to be occurring in the psychotic delusion or the psychotic speech.
or the only grammatical logic that's available to them is one of contiguous arrangement,
Yeah, yeah,
because that's what metonymy is in the Jacobsonian glossary of terms. And I think this gets confused by people. We were talking about this a while back, but I think metonymy as literary style
that's right.
and metonymy in the Jacobsonian sense aren't necessarily the same
They're not,
thing.
no.
They might have something to do with one another,
Right.
but metonymy, I think in the Jacobsonian sense is actually very simple. It's just one word after the other. It's just an arrangement of elements.
Mm,
And I think it's either Jacobson or Saussure that compares it to the different architectural features of a classic Greek structure like Parthenon or something.
right, right,
The
right.
column might have something to do with the architrave because its position near it, it holds up the architrave or the pedestal or whatever. And metaphor, on the other hand, is the idea that instead of a Doric column, you could have a Corinthian column
Mhm, mhm,
or an Ionic column, and that these styles could be substituted for one another. Whereas, like for Schreber, I guess there is no possibility of substituting one style of column for
mhm,
another. That column is that essential element that needs to be there, just
mhm,
like the pedestal needs to be there, just like the architrave needs to be there. All of those elements have to, but of course, no one human mind could manage
mhm.
all of those elements. So eventually there's a breakdown. But there's a I think architecture is kind of an apt metaphor here because it's like there's an architecture to his delusion that needs to be
Yeah.
maintained, but it's very shaky. It's very unstable because there's nothing in the world to back it up. But there is a strange confidence in it too, though, which is really fascinating to me. One thing I wanted to talk about before we move on to the next chapter or move on to any other like lingering thoughts that you have is I would love to hear your thoughts about this because I think you have more to say about this than I do, and it has to do with the symbolic order as a kind of Kantian a priori. And when we were talking to Paris months ago, he mentioned how at this stage of Lacan's thinking, he is likening the symbolic order to something like a priori
Mhm.
structure. Uh, and this is something that I wrote. I'd like to hear your thoughts. It's like uh, the symbolic order struggles against the question of its own foundation and its own limits. It is an order in the sense that it structures the subject's reality, and in that sense, it's similar to a Kantian a priori table of categories, but it is only like an a priori structure for Lacan. It's not exactly an a priori in the sense that it isn't just a grid placed upon raw sense data, which stabilizes the reality in there and makes the latter fully intelligible in accordance with certain criteria of like quantifiability and
Mhm.
measurability and extension. Instead, it's like the signifier generates properties through the activity of this polarization of signifiers. It opens up this zone of meeting through the creative agency of the signifier, but it doesn't establish these like eternal verities
Right.
in the way that we get with Kant's categories. And what it affords the subject is a semblance of a body which has a seeming fixity that sustains a kind of universe which is not one but is only there is something of the one.
Mhm.
I don't want to butcher the French, but you know that
Yeah.
if
Yeah, Leon, right?
il a de l'on,
Yeah.
il y a de
Yeah,
l'on,
Leon.
yeah, like a something of the one, which would make it different from the like Kantian a priori.
Yeah, and I think like with Lacan during this period, the a priori is like as he says in that in lecture 10 of the seminar is that like there is an a priori law embedded with the symbolic which is that of plus and minus, right?
Yeah.
That there is this like opposition of odds and evens, plus and minus, and presence and absence, um in which because of that, like, yeah, to quote when we were saying like right before we're recording, Milner points out in his work on Lacan that the signifier for Lacan has both like an object minimalism of the theory of linguistics, but also a property minimalism, meaning that the object of inquiry is, of course, language. But for him versus the Saussure, it's that language is rather representative of the subject, right? The subject of science. Or in psychoanalysis, it is the subject that is carried forth by the signifier and represented as such, and the signifier is really what is the minimalism of the linguistic theory, and it is minimal in properties, or we should say propertyless, because the signifier is not self-referential. It doesn't contain its own meaning, its own being. It relies on other signifiers to be able to relate meaning and also represent the subject. And because of that, the property creation manifest from the combinatory factor of the articulation of that chain, right? And because it's not contiguity in the Jacobsonian sense, the metaphorical creation is quite different at the level of the unconscious than it would be for just conscious linguistic units in the Jacobsonian sense. So we get we get a more sophisticated we could say topology of the signifier that would explain something like familiar, right? Or the dislocation of signor from signorelli, which is also a stand in via repression for death, right? And the unbearable weight that Freud has to carry being a doctor whose patient committed suicide because of the problem of sexuality, and the bearing the weight of being a doctor, to which doctors, whenever their patients die, people come up to them like, "Doctor, I have some bad news," or having the weight to be like, "Sir, we come to give you some bad news," and "Sir" and "Signor" and "Hair" sort of have the same sort of triangulation meaning. And so I think in there we could understand why this, not just to go to your point about the signifier being a priori, it's simply just a priori, in the fact that like it's not something at the level of like a priori like intuition, but like something that is just, it's a necessary for understanding the function of the signifier, but that it could take on these property creation components based upon its function with other signifiers, because it's not dealing with the referent uh of something that it relates to, because the signifier is privileged by difference and differentiation and that negation process. I don't know if like I went on too much of a tangent on
No, no,
what's
that's
that.
good because
um
it's like people might wonder, well, why does Lacan harp so much on object relations in these seminars? Why the diatribes?
mhm,
Why the constant references to all of these other psychoanalysts who are doing a kind of what he calls judicial astrology and regressing to, without any of the actual analytic meanings of that word necessarily, a pre-Freudian kind of methodology, or turning Freud into a kind of what I would think of as like a vulgate
yeah.
almost. Well, it's because the notion of a fully constituted object, and with it a reality which the ego psychologist or Anna Freudian is supposedly in possession of, can't be accounted for
Mhm,
by their theories,
mhm.
because it's like it's just a very naive presupposition which any philosopher wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily allow themselves.
Yeah, and even thinking about the property creation of that the signifier entails, it really makes a lot of sense when you look at Lacan's reading of Freud, because classical Freudians that we refer to today as are nothing more than just anti-Freudians. They're ego psychologists that maybe adhere more to like the crude Oedipal complex understanding, and also like the stages of libido, oral, anal, phallic, latency, and that like anything that wasn't reconciled during that stage is becomes sort of the ego's defensive process that is trying to like synthesize and be more resilient. But for Lacan, his theory of the signifier matches letter 52 of Freud's letters to Fleece. Um, and the way that the memory function operates on these sorts of like X's and O's for him, which have nothing to do more than just the fact that a memory trace is like the signifier, and that through the combinatory factor creates the property of unconscious memory or unconscious thinking that doesn't bring about anything sort of from the past, but is trying to recreate something to bring about the truth of the unconscious, that knowledge that remains repressed forever, or not forever but repressed until like the right memory combination brings that up, that is important for analytic work, right? And so the theory of the signifier allows us to have a more sophisticated understanding of unconscious working or unconscious mapping, or in Freudian terms he calls it the unconscious thinking, right? And this is also the answer to problem of philosophy, because thinking is not only conflated with being, a la Descartes, but also only thought on the level of consciousness, and how unconscious process could have thinking that's
Yeah.
quite different and could be not only uh, different and differ from contiguity, but also have something contradictory. And here's another thing. This is something that I've been so hysterical about. It's not that there isn't, because they talk about knows no negation or like contradiction, and I hear so many like Lacanians will say like, oh yeah, there's no the unconscious is not contradictory, right? It's like, no, he's not making an ontological claim. What he's saying is that the unconscious knows no contradiction, which means that contradiction is operative in the unconscious, but it does not know it, or it knows not of it, right?
Mm.
And so this is why, if you look at the interpretation of dreams, we could see that the kettle logic of uh you know the kettle was fine when it brought it back to you. The kettle had a hole in it already when I borrowed it from you. I never borrowed a kettle from you to begin with. On their own, these are valid statements, but when they're brought together, they're so contradictory, right?
Yeah.
This is what he's talking about with statements of the unconscious. And so at the level of the signifier, we still see the same thing, and how you could have not only with the signifier a statement, its negation, and opposition, but then also something contrary to it that's operative at the same time simultaneously.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I've started thinking about analysis and the interpretation of unconscious formations in almost this kind of Jamesonian sense,
Right.
because he talks about secondary readings
Mm-hmm.
of a primary text. And he's more in our camp in that I think he condemns is too strong of a word, but criticizes Deleuze because what Deleuze propagates is, or I should say Deleuze and Guattari, not just
Mm-hmm.
Deleuze. I shouldn't pin that on him. But what anti-Oedipus propagates is a very stereotypical, and I think at this point almost cliched criticism of psychoanalysis, which is, oh, you look for this meta psychological, you analysts look for a kind of meta psychological text
Mm-hmm.
in everything people do, think, and try to distill or sieve through speech to bring forth this text, which is Oedipus, in Lacan's case, the signifier, desire of the mother, whatever, and inevitably you find it, right? Uh, you plant the thing that you purport to locate, and of course it's there because you planned it. That's
Yeah.
the criticism. Not to mention it's Eurocentric and
Yeah.
culturally specific. And what about the people from the Trobriand
Yeah.
Islands?
They
They
don't
don't.
Oedipus doesn't exist in that,
They
right?
how could they have had a leaving aside all the objections that we can make to that? It's kind of like the issue of this text that
Mhm.
is getting a secondary reading, and that there's an issue there, and this is something that Jameson's going to try to resolve with his Gray-Mossian square, the semiotic square, with his attempts to map the ideology
Yeah.
in the political unconscious, which is it's like, well, how do you account for the relationship between the latent and manifest text, whether it's dream interpretation that we're talking about or just literary criticism?
Mhm.
There's always a framework that you're relying on, which is supposed to, in some sense, justify its own first principles, and most people don't
Right.
bother to do
Right.
that. I know I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I'll bring it back to what we're talking about. It's like if you're into literature, if you've studied literary criticism, there's a point at which you either have to embrace philosophy and start to like investigate your docent presuppositions, or just adopt a certain form of new criticism, or I don't even know all the
Yeah.
different schools of thought here, but you just have to kind of like blindly
Right.
follow the pack in the sense of, okay, I'll just apply this framework to whether it's historicist or whatever to this text and come up with something novel and interesting and whatever. Who cares? But the point is, what is the relationship between this text, the secondary reading of what's supposed to be an text and its manifestation, its expressive causal
Yeah.
manifestation as a local text? That's a problem. It's a problem that we have to deal with. Well, Milner explains this whole the unconscious is structured like a language thing is it's only when in the session that we bring the unconscious into our everyday differential grammar bound structure that we can therefore read it.
Mhm.
But with a qualification, we aren't reading into it a specific intention,
Mhm.
a motive, a desire that's disavowed in the sense that we don't want to admit to it because it's too taboo or
Right.
it's just socially unacceptable. There is no sense to be gathered there, nor is there the unconscious persisting in any kind of raw form apart
Right.
from this secondary textual reading. And I think that's the beauty of analysis is it says that the unconscious, yes, it exists in a sense
Mhm.
between being and non-being. It appears on its own,
Mhm.
seemingly of its own accord, whether you're in analysis or not,
Right.
because people make jokes, because people make Freudian slips, because people are subject to bungled actions, and a host of other parapraxes. The unconscious, it speaks,
Mhm.
right? But what analysis does by taking those parapraxes seriously is applies a secondary reading to a realm of difference, let's say, for lack of a better term, that is necessary for it to be integrated into our everyday differential speech.
Yeah. No. Yeah. No. I think
Words
you.
fell. I
Yeah.
don't know what.
No. You literally you nailed on it because like yeah, I mean that like ultimately like it's as if the DNG or the Foucault they would have to like straw man to a point their understanding of psychoanalysis for them to hold their criticisms. But even if we steel man the criticisms of DNG as like, desire is always productive, um, you know, even then there's always a sort of limit to productivity that they always apply. Like, but the limit is never really that much interrogated, it seems like. Could be wrong. But I know, like, in instance for anti-Oedipus, the limit is both, for the rhizomatic production or the desiring production. Capitalism and schizophrenia represent, two limits. But I think, like, for them, they have to strawman their understanding of psychoanalysis as aiming at lack, right? Or desire. And it's quite interesting because they don't even get like other things that Lacan's talking about, like the drive, or, you know, the version of the signifier that isn't actually trying to, of course, like there is a lack. There's a lack for the lack in the signifier, if you could say it such, is that the battery bank of signifiers, the field of the other, this multiplicity, in fact, doesn't have one that would complete it. But what I just did, in my honest opinion, you correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm making any sense or jumping to conclusions right away, is that that already entails that there is no possibility for the molar in Deleuzian terms, right? But it doesn't mean there's pure molecular multiplicity, as Badiou will even say, like the understanding of multiplicity or molecularness in Deleuze is actually still synonymous to the idea of the one, right? And so what we have if something like multiplicity is inconsistent multiplicity. There's something of an element that ruptures multiplicity from being consistent, right? Even if it deterritorializes from a text to a molecular language, there's still a consistency to it and not a rupture or a break. And someone like Foucault could only conceive of psychoanalysis as just another ancillary side discourse within the regime of madness and the prison, right? Or
Right.
no, madness in the clinic, right? Whereas Milner says, like, no, like psychoanalysis exists from the major break, which is the discourse of, or not the discourse of science, the major break, which is the modern science, right? And psychoanalysis, if we were to really understand what Lacan is doing, is not to sort of see what was already hidden, right? Or what you kind of just like brilliantly explained about Milner, saying that, like, what we read in the unconscious is not like with some hidden desire intention that we have to disavow. Rather, we just let it speak because, even though we have to read it like a language, or say that the unconscious is structured like a language, it ultimately speaks, but we're not trying to make it conform to contiguity, right? Or conscious language, because then we fall into uh, the Jungian trap of making the unconscious conscious. What we're doing is allowing it to speak on its own terms,
Yeah.
right? Uh, which even with that, it's also another like polemic against Derrida, because the Jung wants to conform to arche writing, right? But the unconscious speaks, even though Lacan is in the business of writing, his writing ultimately conforms to a more sophisticated understanding of the signifier, which is a mathematical logic. And mathematical logic conforms to grammar. It's not a meta language, right? But it aims at a universe of discourse, just like the signifier tries to aim at a universe of discourse, but fails. But what we have to do is not say, oh, well, we either blindly accept philosophical Eurocentrism or we create multiplicity of difference or difference. No, like what we're doing is actually accounting for impasses, right? Ruptures and impasses that allow us to go further to understanding uh, symptomally, not just like this subject who's suffering, but also the subject of science, right? Um, but I think, like, to really add on, because I think you just brilliantly like stated everything. I think really Lacan, what he's trying to get with this logic of the signifier is not to sort of impose meaning or to see what was ultimately hidden, or like, oh, you're just repressing this desire to fuck your mother and kill your father. Like, no, what's being spoken of is like a sort of uh unconscious logic that has to be deciphered. It's not that it was lying in there, but through speaking, different things manifest in the form of this message that have to be deciphered as they're spoken and also written down by the analyst, right? The analysand speaks them, the unconscious speaks, but the analyst writes down
Mm,
these certain things and combines it, in a way
mhm.
that's just, like, also relaying it back.
I like that last thing you said. What did you say? The
Yeah, like that.
Lausanne speaks. The
Yeah, because as Lacan says in the Freudian thing, the unconscious speaks. It speaks the truth, or like as he says in Lyotardie, the half said, right? Um, but it's the analyst that ultimately like writes it down, right? And then relays the message back in an inverted form, right? To
yeah,
get the patient to continue to speak, which is also like getting into like one of the underappreciated things about Lacan. I think we're just riffing out about just Lacan in general. At this point, but Lacan's relationship to analytic philosophy and Wittgenstein, who says like, what we can't say, we must stay silent, but like no, like it does not go without saying. That's the fundamental thing that Lacan says in Lyotardie. The unconscious speaks, so it does not go without saying, right? And what is said will be written down and
and
interpreted like holy writ.
and you're way better on this than I am, but writing down, it's a writing down system.
Yeah, of Schreber's God.
Schreber's and Schreber knows it too, that writing down institutes a a a form of transmission
Yeah.
which is distinct from speech. Um, it's distinct from just, you know, regional logics. It's distinct. I haven't delved as deeply into this as you have, but I think that this is one of the most neglected
Hmm.
aspects of Lacan's entire oeuvre amongst Lacanians. I
Hmm.
think this is where they don't tend to venture any further, which is okay. And this is getting us very far afield of what we're talking about today, but it's always related, of course. But the whole idea of, well, the sexual rapport, which is what Guille Gauffet prefers to relationship. The word rapport can be written. This impossibility can be
Hmm.
written,
Hmm. Yeah, it can be
not
written. Yeah.
not spoken.
Yeah, it can be written, and we make statements about it,
Yeah,
but it doesn't mean we have any knowledge of it. Just in the fact that we could just write statements about this impossibility, right?
and it's because of the potential of this impossibility to be written, and because of the matem
Hmm.
that we do get beyond these charges of relativism and nominalism
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
the part of Lacan, and attempts to provide like a summation of his entire thought. Oh well, it's a form of nominalism.
Yeah.
It's an ultimate perspectivism or relativism. Well, no, the matem is the formalization of these impasses.
Yeah, and also just the fact with even going back to the signifier itself, like he's only giving us like little crumbs of it, but like even the signifier doesn't fall into nominalism itself because like the logic itself is embedded upon language. Of course, there is no universal language that would encompass all language, hence there's no meta language. But the signifier itself is encroaching upon what the Aristotelian logic like the categories is trying to do and the higher analytics, the organon in general, with like the one, the sum, the all, and the not, right?
Yeah.
Those universal particular indications are very crucial to understand the formal functioning of the signifying articulation and in the way that it also applies itself as phallic function for man and woman, these two contraries. Um, and so, in that sense, the signifier and even the mathematics for sexuation cannot fall into relativism or nominalism because we're talking about the speaking being ultimately, right? Who's plagued with knowledge and truth, right? Who's split by it. Um, So it's not a relativism, it's not a nominalism, and it's not a pragmatism. Um, it's like trying to interrogate the problem of knowledge and truth
Yeah.
that has, been a problem for philosophy. But then at the same time, it's not purely nominalism. It's not referring to naming particular things. No, it has everything to do with inaugurating the problem of the universal as well as the problem of the particular, right? There's no pure particulars, nor is there no pure universal, but we can't say that there isn't any universal or isn't any particular, right? That's why he's so adamant about the Aristotelian logic, because he wants to take it to like its logical conclusion.
It's a little
I mean,
over my head at this
yeah,
point.
I mean to kind of bring it back to something we're familiar with, like think about what's Schreber and fatherhood. It makes me think of logical time with I know not what man is, right? I only know man amongst other men. In fear of not being included among the group of men, I consider myself man, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like this problem of the syllogism and this anticipatory function that comes from this embedded logic. Because one of the things that I have been like, I've realized also with Schreber and the message is also similar to like something that we see in law, like clauses, the protasis and the apodosis, which is indicative of also the Cartesian logic of I think, therefore I exist. um, or if I'm thinking, I'm existing, and you see this a lot in law, but also in other colloquial examples too. Like if you like her, then take her out on a date. If you're hungry, then go to McDonald's and get a Big Mac, right? So these conditional statements upon the if, but really what makes the first conditional statement, I guess, what it is the fact of its final syllogistic conclusion. Um, this is exactly what we see operate in the temporal time of the three prisoners. Um, if what does he say? Like the perfect sophism, right? The perfect solution is the protasis and the apodosis. Uh, I am the free subject, and here is why. Right. So we see like a fallacious, or no, what does he say? A specious statement with a fallacious conclusion, a specious protasis, and a fallacious apodosis. Like if A, then B, right? But A is impossible, and B, or A is flawed, and B is impossible,
But
right?
like, because A wouldn't be known without knowing B prior, right? Or
Right, and I'm talking about A and B as the statements, not like as far as prisoner A and prisoner B or prisoners.
no, no, yeah, yeah. That's what I'm saying. That
Yeah,
like, there's no way of knowing the protasis
right,
without knowing
and
the apodosis,
right,
basically.
and in the Cartesian sense, because this logic still applies, all he says is "I am thinking," which is very like you know that statement alone is very, what's the term, uh silly, because it's like, well, of course you're thinking, or to say I'm speaking. Well, I don't need to say I'm speaking to speak, right?
Yeah. Not to mention, you haven't really propped up your I in that state, like
Yeah.
intellectual. I don't know if that's what you're getting
Well,
at,
what I'm
but it's
getting
like
at is
I already implies I'm thinking, right?
yeah, yeah.
Also,
Well, it's just a matter of the statement itself is the speaking truth. I am thinking, therefore I exist, which the for Lacan, really the truth of the statement and the subject is the speaking subject that says I think or I speak. And then anything after that is just like sort of metonymic, but then also like can be fallaciously added, right? To
yeah.
give like a sort of false sense of unity, but also like a false conclusion. Just like the liar's paradox, or the other another logical paradox of saying like this statement is false, and then there's a statement below that says the statement above is true, right? So the protasis and the apodosis don't mutually meet each other, right? They contradict one another, and this is exactly what happens in logical time with the perfect solution and the conclusion to say that I'm the free subject. But what I'm trying to get at is the fact that like the this doesn't seem to be operative for Schreber because he can't even create a protasis to have an apodosis,
Mhm.
right? For Descartes, it's erroneous because yes, he's thinking, but how does thinking equate with the fact that I am or I exist? Lacan even says that there's a distinction between thinking and being, right? And this is where we get into more later Lacan, where we're talking about like the signifier in presence and absence. It's this sort of forced choice of the unconscious of to either think or to be there where I'm not thinking, right? We have to make this choice between thinking and being.
So, all right, like if it protasis, protasis, however you say, is the condition upon which the apodosis follows as consequence,
So they're both
then
conditional. They're both conditions, right? But the apodosis is the main one that you want, and really,
what's also consequence of
it's also
right
consequential.
of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
main condition.
yeah.
So,
I am
if I'm
hungry.
following you though, and I could be totally off here, isn't it that like in the prisoner's dilemma here that the protasis A and the apodosis B, it's like, or whether it's the cogito,
Mhm.
in I, the apodosis is already kind of contained in nuce, as like a nucleus within I already.
Mhm.
So it's like the statement of I attests to the being of I already in a sense, right?
Yeah,
I
and
don't know if that's what you're getting at though.
yeah, like for Descartes at least, because I'm trying to find the exact like statements at the end of logical time. For Descartes at least, it's like this anticipation for certainty, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and so for Descartes, he wants to have knowledge, right? And for this certainty, he puts all of the emphasis of like, even though I'm doubting, I can't doubt that I'm thinking, right? I am thinking. That's his first statement. Therefore I am, right? Or therefore I exist. And so then he could say, I know I exist because I'm thinking. And so he's grounding his existence based on the statement that he's thinking.
Right.
And in the same way, like we have the perfect solution that is allowing prisoner A to be able to say that he's the free subject, right? Um, and of course, there's more nuance to that because he has to be able to explain why he's got the black discs on him to then say he is the free subject.
Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting to think about those last points that I was trying to call
Yeah.
on my head because what he says at the end of logical time is that a man knows not what a man knows what is not a man. Um, men recognize themselves among each other as men. I declare myself to be a man for fear of being convinced by men that I am not a man. So, like that last one right there, I declare myself to be a man for fear of being convinced by men that I am not a man, right?
So you start with the exclusion of something
Mhm.
which isn't even posited to begin with. It's just y- a man knows what is
Not
not
a man, right?
a man,
Mhm.
which could be an infinite number of things,
Yeah,
which is
not
not a
man.
man.
Yeah,
But that doesn't really render any kind of like unified idea of what a man
man is
is
right.
necessarily.
I only know it based upon what is excluded or contrary to what I'm trying to affirm, right?
And then the second step is to apply this
Hmm.
signifier to yourself
Hmm.
and
Among
other
the
men,
other men,
although we don't have any definite signified to
yeah,
attach to it. And then the final step
I
is
declare my
declaring
yeah
oneself.
of being a man for fear of being convinced by men that I am not a man.
Right.
Right. And so, like, to kind of dumb that down and pretty much get at the heart of what I guess I've been trying to explain is that there's this embedded temporal logic of protasis and apodosis that seem to be in cahoots with the shifter of the signifier of the unconscious. Now, we get this operative, of course, in neurotics who repress this knowledge of I think, therefore I am, or um, if I don't get married by the age of 35, then I'm a loser. I'm 35, so therefore I'm a loser, right? And so like these weird like declarations and consequentialisms that occur from that specific declaration or that specific protasis. Like, you know, how does not being married at the age of 35 automatically make you a loser, right? What is embedded within that,
Yeah.
chain of associations to make them create that logical, you know?
So, what about, can we apply that to the case of Schreber not knowing what it means to be a father, and that nobody does,
Yeah.
but we're as neurotics content to accept that we know what it is not, and
Hmm.
could enumerate all the things that it is not, and then
Right.
hastily declare ourselves that within the company of other men or other fathers. Whereas the kind of almost like admirable honesty of a Schreber, which is
Hmm.
obviously not willful, is the idea that he can't arrive at this declaration
Right.
through the exclusion of
Absolutely. Yeah.
the negatives.
Yeah, because I mean, look what he says right here at the end, like the very last passage of this entire essay. He says, after saying those 3 points, this movement provides the logical form of all quote unquote human assimilations, precisely insofar as it posits itself as assimilative of a barbarism, but it nonetheless reserves the essential determination of the I. Dot dot dot.
Hmm.
The I think, therefore I am, or I declare myself. Dot 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 dot. Right. I mean, it still goes back to, yeah, I think you're right in your earlier before reading out this whole thing about the way that the I functions into that. This I declare myself this or that, because the I is of course important for these statements, but you know, only having this sort of knowledge based upon the exclusion, right?
Yeah.
Of the non-being, right? And I think, yeah, I think it is right to because I had an intuition, but I think you explained it perfectly than I did. But like Schreber's dealing with this dilemma of fatherhood, and of course he rejects it, but he's in this process. Like what I was saying earlier, like he was in this like sort of weird intricacies of like fatherhood and non-fatherhood. So he's
Yeah.
trying to navigate what non-father is.
Right.
And
Right.
then these like weird moments of like speculating on a woman's orgasm and then procreation
Yeah. Yeah.
as like sort of weird like insistence on trying to situate himself like within his own crises, because it also makes me think of like going back to the one thing about the discourse of freedom, right? What would be the contrary of freedom, right? Why would, like, because what he says earlier in that homology to understanding psychosis and neurosis is that he likens the neurotic with the discourse of lordship and bondsman, and the difference or contrary of that would be liberation. This is where we see revolutions happening, the liberation of Haiti from the French, etc. But now we live in a modern society where everybody is surrounded by freedom, or at least we like to say that we're free. But we actually find a bunch of ways in which we're unfree. And everything that we try to posit as freedom is, its exact obstacle or impetus, right? Freedom of the market, freedom to own property, etc. But that doesn't explain freedom as such. So we end up like in a sort of crisis. But what would be the sort of contrary of freedom? Would it be liberation? It's like that would be asinine. It's like, why would we need to be liberated from freedom? So like here's like the sort of other, again, a logical inconsistency that we could see Schreber as a man of the Enlightenment and modernity in the discourse of freedom also dealing with.
Which is a kind of double bind
Hmm.
of freedom itself
Yeah.
not being able to hoist itself up onto its own 2 feet, because it's the definition of it is almost, it's self-defeating, it's
Yeah.
self-canceling.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Exactly.
doesn't allow for a subject. What would be, that's why it's funny, it's like the freedom of the market, it's like
Hmm.
we're subjectivizing the market
Hmm.
there, or the
Right.
freedom of, I don't know, natural selection, for example, to select as it chooses according to the certain indis- inextinguishable criteria
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
of perfection, according to some kind of platonic form, and it's a gradual approximation. We have this false sort of debate that goes on in philosophical circles about free will,
Hmm.
and these debates don't resolve anything or get any closer to the nature of this I, because it really is about the subject. So you
Hmm.
could just outsource the subject to an other,
Right.
a personified big other, in a sense of whether it's the market or whatever,
Yeah, or the laws of nature that determine
or
us.
the
So we
laws of
therefore
nature.
have free will. We're just pure determined beings. Free will is an illusion, right? Like the sort of Sam Harris. It's all like an illusion of neurons that make a sort of illusory unity of selfness.
Right.
Yeah,
But then it's like that knowledge, if that's true or not, then what are we to make of
yeah.
the enunciation of that
Of
as a
that,
truth,
right?
and to actually re-register that into the very thing that
Yeah,
we're supposed to
yeah.
be illuminating?
Did the laws of determinism determine me to be able to say that?
Yeah.
That there is determinism and not free will.
Or I'm highly divinely favored
Yeah.
to have this enlightenment such as this has been granted
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
very few mortals, which is the kind of like hubristic tone that these
Yeah,
people deliver these pronouncements in, like
exactly.
Sam Harris. But Sam Harris is doing something Cartesian in his own right, and we like Descartes, of course, but it's that I think it kind of boils down to Descartes doesn't explain away the shifter in
Hmm.
his cogito.
Hmm.
It's all about the shifter
Yeah,
ultimately, and the assumption of it.
yeah, and that, and then like the second discourse where he's talking about like all the things that he's not and negating all that. I think that's where the heart of like the subject, as propertyless, as contentless, devoid of all empirical impurities,
Right.
is really uh like the subject that Lacan is dealing with the subject of the unconscious, who's represented by the signifier.
Because it's like, to take it back to Aristotle, if you think about this primordial real having to do ultimately with the motion of the heavens and this kind of celestial orchestra made up of various complementary harmonies, we aren't yet at the point of putting the subject into question, because in a sense it's not the same subject, and that's why in Seminar 2 he talks about the psychological ego,
Hmm.
whether
Yeah.
there's a psychological ego that's available to Socrates.
Right.
And it makes sense because it's like, well, there's so much in ancient Greek philosophy that seems to resonate with us because it's the inheritance of a certain Western tradition, humanism, later
Hmm. Hmm.
the Renaissance thinking, the Enlightenment. There are all these callbacks to
Right. Yeah.
ancient thinking, but at the same time, what remains sort of opaque to us is, well, the political thinking of the ancient world. And by political, I mean the polis,
Yeah.
and the idea of the body politic, which is equally as constitutional as it is made up of the different strata of society, whether in idealized form or as it manifested in terms of actual oligarchies and monarchies and
Hmm.
democracies. But like the perfect functionality of an ideal society, whether we're talking about Aristotle or Plato, is a much more pressing question for them than our Cartesian subject of science, who is
Hmm.
doubting whether or not he can know anything at all. And even the ancient, like, skeptical, whether it's with the Cyrenaic school, I think is one
Oh,
of them,
the Pyrrhonians. Oh, yeah.
Pyrrhonians, and
Cyrenaics were the Hedonists. Yeah.
there is
Yeah.
right.
Um,
I don't think they aren't
yeah. And
perform.
Sextus Empiricus was the other one.
Yeah, uh, those guys aren't performing this doubting operation in the way
Right.
that Descartes is,
Yeah,
because
because ultimately Descartes makes judgment, whereas like they want to suspend all forms of judgment that would lead to like some type of like dogmatism or erroneous circular arguments. It's like my basic knowledge of
the Pyrrhonians, you're
yeah,
saying, yeah,
of Greek skepticism is like to suspend judgment. That's what it was. Like judgment
right.
that would lead to like metaphysical claims.
And furthermore, it's like they aren't looking to, in any Galilean sense, mathematize the universe for the sake of scientific experimentation. So, this keeping judgments in suspense is not the same thing as trying to reconstitute the world
Right.
in
Yeah.
Cartesian terms
Mhm.
because, well, they aren't dealing with mathematics as literal,
Yeah.
as like having the same sort of agency of the letter.
Yeah, yeah, which would decenter like and break away from the old world. Like they're like still operating within like the Greek Euclidean universe, and for them like they're stuck within an argumentation that is geometrical,
Yeah.
and so like they can only see the flaw of geometrical syllogism as circular. So then like rather than overcoming that and creating a new paradigm, they just suspend their judgment that is only judgment that adheres to geometrical syllogism. Like
Mm.
they don't have a sort of Galilean sense that like inaugurates the subject of science, but also decenters a centered world. Right.
Because for Descartes, it has to do with God,
Hmm.
just like it does for Schreber.
Hmm.
Descartes' God is the same as Schreber's God.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
is not Aristotle's God
No,
because
yeah, exactly.
Aristotle, whether it's the Pyrrhonians or Aristotle, or I think I could make a blanket statement here and talk about any ancient philosopher. They aren't asking themselves, "What I am I for God?"
Hmm.
You know,
Exactly, exactly.
why am I what you say I am in this particular way?
Hmm.
Um, what am I for you? Because God doesn't speak in the first
Yeah.
person. And that's the big difference. Whereas for
Right.
Descartes, God speaks in the first person.
And it's because like and this is where we get into like the Koire with Galileanism versus antiquity, but then Kojève with Christianity versus the pagan world is that Christianity kind of bridges the gap for something like Galileo and Descartes' God, because there is something that Christianity deploys on us to say that we are something for Christ, or we are something for the Son of God who's bringing the good news about God the Father, right? So not only that does God want something, but He also wants something from us, which I think also brings into someone who Lacan is also very interested in is Pascal, right? Because Pascal brings the things like what are we for God, which is another topic, but Christianity paves the way to not only say that there is like a creator, but the creator uses the first person pronouns, but then also wants something from us. We have a part to play, right?
As if we need to supplement that,
Right.
as opposed to just harmonizing
Right.
our own
Yeah.
constitutional body in terms of the
Yeah.
wheeling of the heavens.
Mhm.
And I think what's one of the questions that plagues Schreber is, well, can God predict the
The lottery, right?
the lottery, the
Yeah.
outcome of the lottery? Is there something unknown to
To God.
this
Yeah.
God that speaks in the first person? Because in speaking in the first person, it's as if he God lowers
Yeah.
self almost
Right.
to admit to the reality of a law which supersedes even
Yeah.
his own purview
Right.
in
It's
some
almost like
sense.
as if like he's trying to like play out the what is it, the Euthyphro dilemma of like does God think it's what is it, like, God think it's good because it is so, or is like God himself good? So like is the good higher than God, or God higher than the good?
And for Plato, yeah,
Yeah.
right? Like
I think
it
that
is,
leads like the aporia though, like in that
yeah.
dialogue. Um Yeah,
in
like
the Republic doesn't Plato ultimately posit the one, the form of the good, as
I
all
think so.
being sort of consubstantial in a sense? It's like
I think so, but then like in Timaeus, like the good, the one and the beautiful is like supreme versus God of the demiurge, which is like, that creates the material world but isn't like the true and the good and the beautiful.
right. That's why Lacan says here it's like we have phyla of entities,
Hmm.
and it's just how you stack them
Hmm.
ultimately. Not that the ancients aren't dealing with similar problems,
Hmm.
obviously Socrates is all about aporias. It's all aporetic in that sense. But there are certain kind of like there's a neatness to the resolutions that I think we get in the ancient world that leads to a kind of a stasis, right?
Hmm.
Because stasis is idealized
Hmm.
and is the watchword for ancient philosophy, anti innovation
Right, right, right.
type mindset, for lack of a better term, that characterizes this ancient form of thinking. It lacks, of course, like the dynamism of the letter, which is scientific and ultimately can only come about through a kind of Judeo-Christian break,
Right.
which is what Koire
Yeah.
and Kojève's theorems together form, according to Milner.
Mhm. I think we covered
Yeah, I think that's it. I
everything.
think we solved it. So all nonsense is canceled out.
Neither good sense or nonsense. It's just absence. That's Lacan's
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And we're only getting started. We're gonna finish the psychoses real soon. And for
Possibly even,
book four,
yeah,
I think we're gonna do a kind of truncated version because we just can't drag this
yeah,
out like we've been
yeah.
doing.
And
Um,
even still a question of the succession of the order. We're gonna go like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way
I
up,
just think
which
like four and five are important.
yeah,
Like there's some really good stuff in there. I don't want to just kind of slur over it, but I know that people want
yeah.
seven, they want 11, they want the
I mean, if Becker could do that really fast, he's already at 7. I mean, we can.
yeah, yeah. I'm not trying to keep up with
Yeah,
anybody necessarily. We might we might skip some or do like truncated
yeah,
lectures, and I think we've got some help
yeah,
too.
for
Some
sure.
friends of ours who are going to
No, for sure. Yeah, no.
give us some necessary muscle, some
Yeah,
intellectual muscle here.
but anyhow, enjoy your all symptom. Enjoy your delusion as yourself. Peace.